Eladia Smoke has worked in architecture since 2002. She founded Smoke Architecture as principal architect in 2014 and teaches as a master lecturer at the Laurentians MacEwan School of Architecture. She serves as a founding member of the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada's Indigenous Task Force. Eladia represented Canada in the 2018 Venice Biennale Unseated exhibition as part of an international team of Indigenous designers and architects. Eladia Smoke, thank you for joining me in Canada. I'm just so excited about you being here with us on this global webcast as we look into what's happened and where we're going as a industry, as a people, as a global community. We begin this by asking a fundamental question. Going through the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a tremendous amount of change occur. We are focused on lessons learned. What have you been observing are lessons learned and maybe even lessons that have been adopted by your practice, maybe by your community on a larger basis, maybe across Canada, things that you're seeing and observing? We'd love to hear from you on this.
Thanks, Dave. It's a real pleasure to speak with you this morning. I really admire the work that DesignIntelligence does to think at a high level about issues that affect architects and architecture and urban spaces and suburban spaces, all of those habitats we build as humans. So I want to first acknowledge that I'm joining you from traditional territory of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg peoples. Huron-Wendat as well lived here, and those communities are still alive and well. So some of the new nearby First Nations includes Mississaugas of the Credit and Six Nations of the Grand River, Mississaugas of Scugog. And I also want to introduce myself, Kejigabawik Indijnikas, Obashikakeng and Donjaba, Wabashki Mayingan and Dodem. So my name is Eladia Smoke. My Anishinaabe name means she's quick or she's fast. And my home community is Obashikakeng or Lac Seul First Nation, but I also have family in Alderville First Nation, just east of Toronto. And on my mom's side, family from Toronto and Winnipeg. So that's me. I'm principal architect with Smoke Architecture, and I founded that company in 2014, but I've been in architecture since 2002, and it's a real pleasure to join you. My clan is White Wolf Clan. Some of the changes that I've seen in my own practice include, need to switch over to using a lot of digital formats. So that's no surprise. And my firm really focuses on engagement with our clients so that clients have agency in the decisions that affect their built environments. This is something that has been a huge challenge for Indigenous peoples in Canada and across the continent due to the forces of colonialism. And many of the decisions, right from the conception where we establish what gets funded, to how that funding rolls out, to how those projects are designed, are out of the hands of our Indigenous peoples. Now we're seeing a greater emphasis on reintegrating those perspectives into the built environment, just for Indigenous peoples, but actually for all peoples in Canada. So I'm seeing this as a greater emphasis placed, rediscovering those Indigenous perspectives in built environment, which have an awful lot to do with reconnecting with our natural world and with each other. And because of the impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic's restrictions everyone has experienced, I think everyone has become more cognizant of how tremendously important natural areas are to our mental health and overall well-being. Shut up inside with very little physical human contact has really sent us all out of doors to sort of commune with the other life cycles that surround us. And I really hope that that continues to be a focus of I guess, our emphasis placed on creating those naturalized areas, not just in wildlife preserves or conservation areas, but embedding them in our urban areas as well. So some of the projects I've worked on, for instance, Centennial College in Scarborough, that I'm undertaking with Dialogue and Elliston, has an Indigenous planted garden at the main entry that follows the natural topography of the land there. It also has an Indigenous planted internal courtyard garden, and that is actually a direct connection to Shkagamakwe, which is Mother Earth, and it extends through all levels of the building, even the basement. You can see that visual connection. So those are really coming to the forefront of people's minds, I think. Another emphasis that I have seen from the pandemic is a realization of how tremendously important human interaction is to us. So those connections with each other. And again, due to some of those fallouts from colonialism, a lot of times we find that we get divided along lines of race or lines of socioeconomic success, and it has pulled us apart. When we reintegrate and start to interact again, I am hoping that newfound appreciation for how important we are to each other will extend across those artificial barriers. We are seeing that in Canada, in that we are realizing how sublimated Indigenous perspectives have been from mainstream Canadian culture. This was a deliberate effort, and it was highly successful, to the point where even Indigenous peoples don't have access to our own teachings, philosophies, and ways of being. We are seeing that re-emerge, and I think actually the remote and digital techniques that we're using are allowing us to reconnect with people who have carefully maintained those teachings over time. I know my very good friend Ralph Johnson, Peshawanibinus is his Anishinaabe name, has been running every Saturday a teaching session where Indigenous knowledges are shared. He's an elder and a very good friend. And that has been tremendous to see. So I hope that also continues, that newfound appreciation for each other. One final thing that I wanted to mention is that Canada, for the very first time, is finally, after multiple false starts, instituting a national child care system, because all of us have been at home having to care for children, and women are bearing the brunt of this added burden. And as a result, now that the men are also in the home and trying to, do these remote meetings, and the kids are in the background doing their kid things, there's a newfound appreciation for how tremendously important childcare is. And so the government has just released the budget and a big step forward in funding a national childcare program, which is really going to assist Canadian families, and especially women, to sort of alleviate some of that burden of having to play all roles. So that's another really positive thing come out of this.
Oh, it creates a new playing ground of equity, to tell you the truth. Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing those lessons learned. But now I'm thinking about the future. And there are so many changes that have occurred that will revert back to same old. But we're hoping that there are permanent changes that are occurring. And certainly we have seen that in the way people live, the way they communicate, the way that they buy and sell things, the way they work. But our question to you is, what are you predicting over this next trajectory to be what we'd call permanent pivots into the future? We'd love to hear from you on this.
Thanks, Dave. I hope all of those are going to be permanent that I mentioned. So newfound appreciation for the tremendous ability of natural systems other than human life to support our mental health and well-being, and an added emphasis on caring for those natural systems and integrating them into our urban spaces, as we realize that natural life other than human life and human life are not mutually exclusive, nor should they be, and they should never have been conceived that way. That is one permanent change I really hope to continue to see. Another one is how Indigenous perspectives can guide us forward into the future. So wisdom that has been carefully honed through millennia of inhabiting our territories in North America and in other across the globe, that there's a newfound joy rediscovering the revelatory strength of these teachings and applying them to contemporary problems. I really hope to see that. And then rediscovering the value we place in each other, in listening to each other across racial lines that are really invalid, across socioeconomic lines that have been artificially created through arguably detrimental systems of economics, that we rediscover each other, and how important true connection between ourselves is, and that we continue to use the tools that we have available to us, this amazing ability to connect remotely across great distances in a meaningful way that you and I are doing together, you in Atlanta, me in Anishinaabeg territory, and that we are able to share this wonderful moment of, important thought. I hope we don't lose that. I hope we continue to use those tools. And finally, that we care for our generations, all four of our generations, young people, youth, adults, and elders, and that we realize how tremendously important all of them are to us. Here in Canada, we had a tremendous impact from the pandemic on our senior care facilities. So we had a great loss of life and an ongoing great loss of mental health in those facilities because of the extreme isolation inflicted on our older people. And I think we have to find better ways of taking care of our children, taking care of our elders, because they bring a spirit and a knowledge that the other generations don't have as much. So there's a saying that I've heard from elders that have taught me, and that's children are our greatest teachers. So as we see the Canadian government hopefully instituting this nationwide childcare program, I hope that we also realize that children have so much to teach us, and also that our seniors, far and beyond just providing a basic level of care, that we allow them to do the work they were placed here to do, which is share their wisdom with us, and that we enhance those interconnections between the generations and really take care of each other. So those are the four things I hope we will see become permanent.
Those are so spot on, and our grave concern continues for the elderly across the world who have been almost targeted by this virus, but it has been extraordinary to see the reaction of most societies of a new awareness of the value of seniors in our society. I think about the old saying that wisdom is wasted on the old because the youth don't want to hear it, kind of thing. But I think that there's a newness coming where the elders will become the most honored. It's interesting. I was talking to a colleague a few days ago, and he was lamenting the idea that, gosh, I've gotten old and nobody wants to listen to me. And yet it took him 50 years to accumulate the wisdom. And yet then the wisdom goes into a box and never finds its application. I'm really hoping that we are going to create a permanent context for those who have gone on before to teach us the lessons of the journey along the way. So critical. And I love that statement about the children. I think the most wonderful attribute of childhood is this unencumbered trust. And wouldn't that be something if our default was trust as opposed to suspicion, cynicism, sarcasm, negativity? Wouldn't that be something? I wonder how the world would change in those contexts. So our third question is, when we at Design Intelligence, we have a deep conviction. And that conviction is that equity, healthiness, which means both mental and physical health, and the environment. These are inextricable linkage between these three. And the design community, more often than not, does not design or contemplate all three at the same time. We often will focus on healthiness to the neglect of sustainability, and certainly not dealing with equity. I think most projects around the world have been somewhat obtuse to the idea of equity and of displacement and of creating barriers for inaccessibility, and not even understanding that this is what's happening. So our question to you today is, how do we, as a design community, lead the charge across the built environment in understanding all three of these dimensions, equity, healthiness, and environmental responsibility, in all of our designs all the time? What words of wisdom do you bring to us around these things?
I'm reminded of a project I recently undertook at Queen's University. They're creating an Indigenous gathering space there, and they referred us to their website and asked us to take their accessibility training modules. And I was like, oh, this is going to be terribly boring. Oh no, I'm going to have to, devote an hour and a half, 2 hours of my time to this exercise just to tick a box. And then I started going through the accessibility training, like, because it was all of the barriers that everybody faces. It wasn't just people with mobility issues. It wasn't just people who are racialized, and it wasn't just people who don't find themselves represented in, sort of the prestigious spaces or professions of our world. It was everybody. And I thought there's huge parallels to be gleaned from creating spaces that reflect who we truly are, which is everyone, and connecting with each other in that way, and creating spaces that are specifically look and find barriers that are inherent and just assumed and therefore invisible. Seeking those out and eliminating them so that everyone has access to these spaces that we can enjoy together. Spaces that invite a diverse range of activities, because I know as an Indigenous person, the way that we gather is, I think it's inherently human. I don't think it's really sort of a racial or maybe not even a cultural thing, but we like to have food and we like to gather in a circle because the circle has all these teachings associated. It's the cycles of nature, the cycle of life. It's the acknowledgement that everyone who is in that circle is on an equal footing with everyone else. It's egalitarian in that everyone who comes to the circle has an equal contribution to make and a responsibility to make that contribution. So that circle is tremendously important to us because it connects us with the larger picture of life in the world, the motion of the sun, the shape of the world, the flow of life that surrounds us. And that circle has so many teachings that every single time you talk about it with an elder or knowledge carrier, you will find a different meaning in that circle. And that's a circle that we don't always see in our built environments. So even the fact that most of the time we meet in rectangles for some reason is sort of a hindrance to Indigenous knowledge sharing. That's not something that you'd perhaps immediately cotton on to unless you go and speak to Indigenous peoples. So I think the answer to creating spaces that are inherently sustainable, that inherently promote wellness, that inherently are equitable, is to speak to the people who are going to use that space in a really meaningful way, so that you hear these perspectives from them and then act on what you hear. Because that knowledge is inherent in our client base, in our participant base, in our inhabitant base. It's just oftentimes as designers, we don't, for some reason, always in a rigorous fashion, go out and speak to those people. We sort of figure, okay, I've got my training, I've got my, professional perspectives, I've really researched this site, and I'm going to give them the answer. But that is not design. Design is a process whereby we listen. And we distill what we've heard into a design response that is genuinely responsive. So when I speak to my client base, which is largely Indigenous, I always hear, how are we going to affect the life that surrounds us? How are we going to create a space that we can afford to run over a very long term? How can we create a space that's going to be durable and we don't have to fix it all the time? How are we going to create a space that invites our elders into the space? Where are the spaces for children? I'm thinking of this wonderful project that I undertook together with Wanda Dalla Costa and David Fortin. David Fortin actually runs the McEwen School of Architecture as their director, and Wanda Dalla Costa teaches at Arizona State University. And we came together, our three firms, and we created a conceptual design response to Indigenous people space directly across the street from the parliamentary precinct in Ottawa. That's our capital city. And we brought onto the design team an elder or a knowledge carrier, Winnie Pitawanakwat, who's Anishinaabeg. She's Anishinaabe. And she said this thing that I'll never forget, which is, when our grandmas come and see this building, they should see themselves in it and they should feel welcomed. And another thing she said was, on the main level, we really have to have a place for children to play around. There has to be a place for them. When people open the door, they should see all these children playing in the front entrance. And then another thing she said is we have to remember those people who don't have homes in Ottawa, because there are a lot of them and they're struggling, and they should have a place here. There should be a place where they can come and sit and feel comfortable. And this is a cross from the highly Beaux-Arts, super formal parliamentary buildings in the capital city of Canada, right? And outside in the yard, there was this vacant lot. They primarily use it for queuing to get tickets to go into the parliament buildings and tour them. It's a completely unused vacant lot, and I'm shocked because it's this tremendously prominent site in our capital city. And it's just a barren sort of paved lot. And so we kind of just low-key took it over. We kind of embraced it in this blanket-like shape. And we said, okay, this is where we're going to have those events where we connect to the larger world, because that physical connection to Mother Earth, Shikagamikwe, is so important to us. So we built an immemorial flame there, directly across from the Centennial Flame. Canada sort of built it to honor our 150th birthday as a country. And so directly across on axis with that Centennial Flame, we created an immemorial flame to honor the millennia of inhabitation since time immemorial of Indigenous peoples. And around that, we envision people, anybody, tourists, anybody can come and see an ongoing program of cultural sharing events in that space, sort of sheltered by this blanket that wraps around the existing building. And so there were all these gestures that you just would never have thought of unless you asked a person who has this depth of understanding of what it means to be human, that Indigenous ways of knowing and being, we call it. But it's really just being human and appreciating each other and appreciating the good things about each other. But like inviting homeless people into like the space that represents all Indigenous nations in Canada right across from the Parliament, amazing. The first thing you should see when you open the door, kids playing. what grandma thinks when she first see it. Oh yes, I recognize this as us. I want to go in there. I feel welcome. You know, like those are amazing, amazing gestures. And the reason we wrapped it in a blanket is because this was an old heritage Beaux-Arts building with a terrible building envelope. It just bleeds heat. And they'd actually blocked off a lot of the windows because it had sat vacant for 30 years. And they're like, finally, okay, we'll gift it to Indigenous peoples. And we were like, what are we going to do with this building? Because we have to honor the heritage aspect of it, because it represents a snapshot in time of how Canadians did architecture, which was we took it across the ocean and plonked it down here. And so we want to honor that as a thing that we did. So we wrapped it in this blanket to shelter it. And we created an interstitial space where you could encounter that heritage space, but in a friendly and welcoming environment. And then we wrap the whole thing in regalia with these constantly in motion. We called it regalia because each community would create this handcrafted object that then we created a framework. It could come hang, so they could be physically present. All of our communities across the whole continent could be physically present and see themselves like in real life there in Ottawa. So I thought that that's a way of doing it. And we would never have thought of all these things if we didn't speak to the client group. We spoke to Assembly of First Nations. We spoke to Inuit Tapiriits Kanatami. We talked to Métis National Federation. And we talked to all of those people and had long meetings with them to listen to what they said. And we had Winnie on our side. So those are the types of things that I think bring together all those three crucial things you said: wellness, equity, and, sustainability, which are really all the same thing.
Wouldn't that be extraordinary if the next Ritz Hotel in the lobby was a place for children and older people to hang out and play when you came in to check in? No, honestly, that is the essence of being human, is we know we're home when the kids are playing and grandma's rocking. And what an extraordinary response to this question. I'm hoping that our audience is listening to this. It is a global solution for us to consider its application into our various contexts. Eladia, thank you so much for joining me and being a part of this broadcast. We appreciate and value your insights from Canada. All the best.
Thanks. You too, Dave. I really appreciate the chance to speak with you. It's been lovely.